Hello and welcome to Housing Today Live 2024. Today, myself and our panel of experts will be exploring the impact of sustainability regulatory changes on the UK housing sector. This is our second and last webinar today. Earlier, my colleague Carl Brown spoke with an expert panel about the implications of Awaab's law for housing providers. So if you're interested in that, you can access a recording on our website. Likewise, this session will be available to rewatch later today using the same link you've used to join us now. The recording should be ready within about half an hour of us finishing here. For this panel, make sure to send us any questions you have throughout, as it'll help us get the most out of our interesting panel. Speaking of whom, let me introduce them. We've got Richard Ellis, who is Director of Sustainability at Peabody, Mitch Cook, who is Director of Greengage, and we're hoping to be joined by Lynn Sullivan, who is Chair of the Good Homes Alliance. She's having a bit of a technical trouble now, but hopefully we'll be able to get her on in time to talk to you. So I'm sure you're all as keen as I am to hear from our panelists, so let's get right into it. Richard, can you kick us off?
Yes, of course. Thank you for letting me come in. Let me know when you can see my screen. I'm just going to share a couple of slides. Can you see that, everyone? I'm going to go for a yes.
Looks good to me.
Great, thank you. So yes, a little bit of blurb about Peabody. We've got 107,000 homes, 230,000 residents. We've got a way to go to get to net zero carbon, but we're working our way there. So we've got 78% of our existing estate is EPC A to C. We've got about 25,000 homes we need to get up to EPC C and then to go beyond. We've got 220 heat networks as well, quite a lot, but we're being mandated more and more about that, and I'll talk about that later. We want to get to EPC C by 2030 and then net zero by 2050. We have looked about trying to get it sooner, and at the moment it's just really, really tough. But we built 2,400 homes last year. A couple of things I want to pick up today is one around the future homes and building standards. This is coming in 2025. Essentially, we're going to be looking at electrified heat and hot water. So we need to get ready for that. There are a number of issues and problems around it: grid capacity, grid supply, getting the right type of heating into our properties. But it's coming, and it's something that we're going to have to deal with. So how we're looking at it is around reducing down the energy demand. I know that the Future Home Standard doesn't say much, unfortunately, about improving thermal performance, but of the fabric. But we're looking to see whether or not we can reach passive house standards. So reduce the energy demand. We're briefing passive house at the moment. We're looking to, but however, we recognise that we're in obviously a competitive market, and the schemes need to stack up. So we are actually following a twin track approach. So when we're tendering, we tender for passive house, and then we also tender for what meets the Future Home Standard. We've got biodiversity gain, but Lynn, I think, is going to talk much more around that. So we've brought that in, and we're also looking at climate resilience in design. So we use overheating models, we use flood risk maps to see how we can design something that's going to be good for not the next 5 years, 10 years, but the next 20, next 30 years. One of the other things that we're looking to do, which I'll come on to in a bit, is actually scenario planning. So what happens in the world, what risks and opportunities are we going to find when we hit 1.5 degrees, when we hit 2 to 3 degrees, and then 4 degrees, which unfortunately we're on track for at the moment. All of that we take to inform our new homes. The other thing I wanted to pick up was around heat networks. As I said, we've got an awful lot of heat networks, and at the moment they are unregulated, an unregulated space. they are going to be regulated from 2025. It keeps drifting, but the last I've been told is that it's definitely going to be regulated. Ofgem are going to be the regulator. It will give us consumer protection, and I'm sure everyone has seen in the papers last year, people had their heat network tariffs go up by 900%. This will give us a little bit more protection around that. There are improved technical standards, stepping arrangements as well. What happens if an ESCO fails? And then we've got heat network zoning as well. But it will apply to all communal heat and district heat networks. It's a really big thing, and it's something that we're working very hard in the background to try and make sure that we get all of the information together so that we can show what we're doing for our residents and to the regulator.
Okay, so hopefully,
and then going on from to heat zoning, we know this is going to come in probably in 5 or 6 years' time. They're already starting to carve up the country, and especially certainly the cities, in terms of where there's going to be a heat network zone. Those will then be tendered, and you'll have a heat network zone operator from there. As I understand it, it may change, but that's what they're talking about at the moment. And the idea here is to grow our heat networks from 3% that we've got in the country at the moment to about 20%, and to get cheaper and cleaner heat in, and to normalize it. It happens in the continent all the time, but we've never really got to grips with heat networks. We tried it in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but they've been ripped out when cheap gas came in. So it's something to be aware of. And again, it's something that we have to look at when we're looking at our existing estates and when we're looking at our new estates. And then the other thing that I wanted to pick up, and we could talk later on if people want to talk around retrofitting, but the other thing I wanted to talk about was finance. So the big thing that we've seen over the last year or so is the increasing demands in reporting from our lenders. And our ESG loans, and when we're talking to the banks were told by their regulator they had to start managing downstream climate risk, so their scope 3 emissions. To do that, there's a methodology that came out, and I'm going to get this wrong, so apologies, but it's a task force related climate financial disclosures. That close, but it's moving into the financial reporting regulations. So we're looking at what's the governance around climate risk, what's your climate strategy, what's your risk management, and what are the metrics and targets. People are asking for this in huge amounts of detail now, and we're seeing the impact of that in terms of what we're trying to do. We are about to start doing a TCFD gap analysis to see what we need to learn and how we can improve. But in the last 2 audits that I've had, external audits on our business plan, they're using this methodology. So it's certainly something to get your head around and start having a look at it. If we can get this right, we will have access to more funding and hopefully slightly cheaper funding. But it's a real thing that's sort of developed over the last 1.5 to 2 years, and it is due to come in 2025 for the listed companies first, but it will come down to the larger housing associations. Right, that's just a very whistle-stop tour of what we're really looking at the moment. Hopefully that's okay.
Great, thanks very much, Richard. We're going to hear from Mitch now. Just as a note, could the speakers remember to mute while they're not giving their presentations? And please keep sending your questions through the chat. Mitch, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share my screen. Can you see this now? Can you see that now? Okay. Yep.
Looks good. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. So thank you for having me on this afternoon. I will give a little bit of an introduction to who I am and Greengage, but I wanted most of the presentation to be around biodiversity, which is something that I'll be talking about in today's slot. So I am one of the directors at Greengage. Greengage is a sustainability consultancy. We cluster our services around 3 principal challenges. First is climate change, so looking at how buildings align with net zero. The second is essentially looking at biodiversity in nature and how we can address the biodiversity decline. And the third is about the interaction between green infrastructure and nature-based solutions and the community, so how the wider social value component. So that's a bit about who we are. So I'm going to talk about biodiversity, if I can get the slides to work. No. Okay, I think we might have to just make it the old style way. So you can see the next slide. So I'm going to talk about biodiversity and nature. Obviously, one of the main changes that have happened over the last few years, but from a mandatory point of view earlier this year, is the introduction of biodiversity net gain as a requirement for new developments. Now, there are some exemptions to that, but generally what we will see is that all new developments that are being brought forward will require a biodiversity net gain assessment and a mandatory requirement of a 10% uplift. The biodiversity net gain is a metric that looks at habitats, so it's very good in terms of understanding the habitat change, and the uplift in habitat value is a proxy measure for biodiversity. But one of the things it doesn't do is it doesn't really look at biodiversity nature in the wider sense. So it's good as a proxy for biodiversity in nature, but doesn't look necessarily as the increase in terms of species diversity for birds and bats and for invertebrates, for example. However, what it has done is it has brought forward the discussion about biodiversity to the very front end of the development process, certainly in terms of site selection, but also layouts and the implication of landscaping and the nature of that landscaping. For those that haven't seen it yet, the picture on the right-hand side is a picture of the metric itself, but also the output of what that delivers. And I guess the point here is for most urban developments, delivery of biodiversity net gain and 10% mandatory requirement is relatively straightforward. Those that have any vegetative cover of any sort, be it playing field or kind of scrubby areas, those are more difficult to deliver biodiversity uplift. But those sites that we're seeing in urban areas are relatively simple. And that means that whilst it is a good metric and a good measure of biodiversity, what it doesn't do is give that broader biodiversity value across different species mixes. But what we have seen, of course, is that it then looks at how biodiversity might be implemented across schemes and the value that green spaces and habitats are creating. And this green infrastructure, or the vegetative connected spaces, have a wider benefit that is now being looked at both in terms of placemaking, but in a range of different features overall. Those people that are familiar with the London context, and for context is in other urban areas, whilst we're seeing biodiversity net gain as a habitat, these are the sort of features that should also be incorporated. So those pictures show things like sandy piles, log piles, areas of pebbles, and that gives the broader biodiversity value that delivers value for birds, invertebrates, etc. Particularly those at a lower end of the food chain that then provide food and foraging opportunities for those further up the hierarchy. But of course, what this does do is it creates the opportunity for nature to connect with people, but also create a range of different services that nature can provide for urban developments and for developments overall. And this is what we are now seeing coming forward, both from a regulatory point of view, but also from a wider stakeholder point of view. So these additional green infrastructure benefits, or these ecosystem service benefits, can now be identified both as a baseline condition. So does the site currently provide a value for pollination? Does it provide a value for air and water pollution control? Does it provide an opportunity for urban heat amelioration? And so these things can be identified. And similarly, therefore, where development should go to create the most value can also be identified and mapped. And what we are seeing and helping clients with now, particularly with those that have larger land holdings, is identifying where development should and shouldn't go to maximize this ecosystem value overall. And there are a number of tools out there that you can use. We use a mix of different tools to create the matrix of those benefits that helps the decision-making process. And I think the point here is that whilst we are seeing biodiversity as something that creates the discussion around green infrastructure, that wider ecosystem service is something that both our clients and the wider stakeholder groups are expecting to see come forward. This is an exercise that we've done for one of our clients, and this is Canary Wharf. It shows the green infrastructure interventions and the value that it creates from a biodiversity, but also wider natural capital and ecosystem service. And this can be done on a kind of dashboard approach. And just picking up on what Richard was talking about before, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure often sees climate mitigation and adaptation being delivered through nature-based solutions, so that green infrastructure. And many of the people that are now reporting, albeit voluntary at the moment, are using nature-based solutions and green infrastructure as that mitigation for climate change as part of their delivery plans. But of course, whilst we might understand the impact on from climate on real estate and buildings, and that can be modelled using various Met Office outputs, but also other modelling software. What we are less clear about is the impact that real estate has on nature generally. So we understand the impact it has on a particular location from baselining and using BNG to identify the uplift. But what we don't know necessarily, and was less clear, is the impact that we have on where the materials to build those buildings come from, and the value chain, the impact from the value chain. And so close on the heels of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is the TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And we are generally just getting our heads around what this is, but essentially splits between businesses that have a dependency upon nature, and an obvious one is agriculture, but also those businesses that have dependency upon nature to provide materials or a service. And in the real estate world, this is primarily where wood or metals or the materials for building buildings comes from. And this requires, the TNFD requires an understanding of where they come from, the impacts, and then how to mitigate those impacts. And we are therefore seeing work coming forward and structures coming forward in terms of how those impacts and dependencies are identified, but then what metrics are required to show an improvement against those impacts and dependencies. And I think actually it's probably going to be a game changer. And already there are reports and assessments coming out on embodied ecological impacts associated with sand and gravel, and I said wood before. So it's a very interesting space that looks at nature strategies for organizations, not just in terms of the development pipeline and the buildings and the sites they're looking at, but also more broadly in terms of where those materials are coming from. And if they are from high areas of biodiversity value, how that might both be affected by climate change, but also how that would need to be directed elsewhere so that those areas of high biodiversity value are no longer impacted in the same sort of way. So that's a kind of the topic area I wanted to cover today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass over.
Thanks very much. We're now going to hear from Lynn Sullivan, who has been able to join us, thankfully. Lynn, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, apologies for the glitch. I'll try sharing my screen. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, I'm Lynn Sullivan. I'm an architect by profession. I chair the Good Homes Alliance. I also chair the National Retrofit Hub, and I'm the Buildings 2030 lead for the Green Construction Board, part of Construction Leadership Council. So the Good Homes Alliance has been campaigning for better quality in homes since we started 17 years ago. And one of the key sort of good things is that the sustainability agenda has obviously risen during that period, but it was slightly thwarted by the zero carbon homes target being scrapped in 2015. But more recently, there's been, because of the growth requirements, there's been a big focus on the context and, you know, how consumers see growth and housing, and as well as standards. And so the National Model Design Code throws a requirement onto local authorities that design code should be consistent with current legislation and look ahead on sustainability. However, although it's good on contextual stuff, I think many of us believe it's not well integrated enough in terms of the climate change objectives, and I'll go on to elaborate further on that. So why is the planning system cited as a barrier? I mean, there have been some really good things, and Mitch has just talked about the requirement for biodiversity net gain, which was enacted through the Environment Act. But since the Paris COP21 in 2015, many local authorities have made climate emergency declarations, and they've been looking to reflect in their local plans policies on both planning and building standards which reflect those ambitions. And the situation is confused. So some local authorities have had local plans reflecting those ambitions passed through the planning inspectorate, and others have had them pushed back. And there was a written ministerial statement in 2015, which was never enacted through the Planning and Energy Act, I think it was, or was it the Levelling Up Bill? I can't remember. But there was a recent ministerial statement also suggesting that local authorities should not set their own standards, whilst many of them already have. So there's a great confusion at the moment about the ability of local authorities to reflect their ambitions in both planning and building standards. And there was a very good report last year from the Town and Country Planning Association, as well as the Climate Change Committee, lamenting the lack of clarity really in planning regarding our net zero ambitions. And it points out that some key issues for sustainability in housing, such as connectivity, you know, the provision of transport connections and the supporting for walking and cycling and so on, that are absolutely key to the whole carbon footprint of a place. Those and resource planning issues, such as for water and energy, can only really be successfully enacted or supported by a bigger picture connectivity through planning authorities at regional and national level. But they really emphasize the power of planning as well as for building standards to reach our goals. So, and they also highlight, by the way, resilience adaptation measures must be addressed in both national model design codes and local planning policy. So recently there's been quite a few reports which talk about concerns about house building and housing quality, which have been fairly consistent over the years, certainly since Good Homes Alliance have been running. And this report from the Competitions and Markets Authority, which is after all a government arm's length body, it calls out that neither planning nor building regs address concerns re land allocation and therefore delivery rates, as well as affordability and, most importantly, quality in new homes. And they've even launched an investigation into a possible collusion by the major house builders in contravention of the Competitions Act. So really some big questions here about the quality of our current housing, and that's under our current regulatory framework, and whether these issues can be addressed. At the same time, we're getting consistently consumer concerns about quality. This Chartered Institute of Building report last December, based on a cross-section of the house buying public, found a huge concern about new housing quality. Actually, the majority saying that they wouldn't buy a new home because of their concerns about poor workmanship, and that they think existing homes are a better quality, which is pretty stunning, really. And also the great white hope in terms of housing quality in the form of the housing new homes ombudsman has been pretty roundly criticised, not least by the Homeowners Alliance. So consumer concerns haven't gone away. Our sort of great hope really was the new legislation coming in under the Future Homes Standard. And this was foreshadowed by the Climate Change Committee in their 6th budget of 2020, now 4 years ago, calling for the government to publish a robust definition of Future Home Standard, preferably in advance of 23. We've only just had it at the end of last year. And to implement a strong set of standards which made sure that buildings perform as designed and deliver high levels of energy efficiency, as well as heat decarbonisation. So we were led to expect that this would be an absolute game changer. However, the first consultation by DLUC set out a draft standard, and 72% of the consultee responses said that draft standard wasn't ambitious enough, and that was in 2021. So at the background to this is that we also, post Paris COP in 2021, there was many moves to define, if you like, moving away from this idea of a zero home standard to think about a Paris-proof targets for new homes. And so this sort of added to the expectations really around the Future Home Standard. And last year in COP28, there were more commitments to grid decarbonisation as well as energy efficiency. But there are ongoing concerns, not least from the National Infrastructure Commission and the Climate Change Committee, that our infrastructure is inadequate for these targets, if our reliance is just on heat switching and the rate of decarbonisation of the grid. Because we all know that it's not just about getting more wind power, it's actually about thinking about the energy mix, thinking about the times of year when the wind doesn't blow, and really reinforcing our grid. So I'm sort of mounting up all these expectations really. At the beginning of last year, I did a launch for this report for our Good Homes Alliance, and this was a longitudinal study commissioned by government, DESNZ, of a five years worth of research on exemplary new home developments, called The Building for 2050, if you haven't seen it, and I do recommend it. And this shows how even homes built to the highest current regulatory standards, i.e. even beyond current building regulations, were not delivering certainty on performance. There was still a performance gap of up to 2 to 5 times on space heating, for example, and that there were still issues about overheating and higher bills. These new standards are not delivering higher bills. So it all kind of came to a crisis, or a high point, we were hoping, in December last year, when we had the consultation on the Future Home Standard finally published. And however, our view is that there was very little, well, there's no improvement in building fabric over the latest building regs standard, which is 2021, although there is an option to support integrated solar. That's one of the options, and it does support the electrification of heat, which of course we support. However, although there's a new metric calculation model, it is not proposed to change the current calculation, which is based on a notional building. There's no requirement to test building performance on completion, i.e. to properly tackle that performance gap, only a voluntary proposal for post-occupancy, which of course then gets involved in what individual home occupants are using on their non-regulated side. And I think Mitch mentioned, being able to count the carbon impacts of where the materials come from. There's absolutely nothing yet, although we've been promised it for quite a while, on the requirement for embodied carbon calculation, in other words, whole life carbon calculation. And there's still questions about the ventilation system. So as a culmination, I wanted to flag today that yesterday, which was the closing of this consultation, hence the very topical discussion today, we, Good Homes Alliance, along with LETI, UK Green Building Council and Bioregional, have sent a letter to the Secretary of State calling for what we call a fit for purpose future home standard. And we have had 250 organisations as co-signatories, including local authorities and developers, and a host of other industry actors. So I do recommend you have a look at this on the Good Homes Alliance website. So, we are in a climate emergency. We are in an environmental emergency. And we just feel that the pace of change in regulation is sadly lagging far behind. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Lynn. We've got just under half an hour to have a conversation about some of the issues that have just been raised there. This is your opportunity to send some questions in. We've already got one which asks, what are the first steps organisations should be taking to help ensure they are meeting their sustainability regulatory requirements? Richard, would you be able to start us off on that? Give us the sort of housing association perspective.
Yes, of course. The first thing I would say would be know your data, know where your emissions are, know where your scope 1, 2 and 3 are as much as you can. And know scope 3 is really difficult, but that will be the majority of most people's carbon emissions. So I would look at that. I would then use that to set your targets so that you've got something that's deliverable and you've got a roadmap. And then the other thing that I think that is often, can be missed is actually you've got to prepare your teams, your stakeholders, your suppliers to start changing the culture. If you don't educate and change the culture, then actually it makes it really, really difficult to drive the improvements that you want to drive.
You mentioned knowing your data there. Do you think the current state of knowledge across the sector is strong? Do you think people have a good sense of their housing stock and how it's performing, for instance?
I would say it can be patchy. If you take our housing stock is not all of our emissions. I mean, not by a long chalk. So, but there are a lot of good models out there where you can work it out. There are ways of being able to take aggregated energy demand as well from different places so that you can actually work out how much energy you're using and where you can improve it. But I would say that people generally have got a little bit of a way to go.
Great. Lynn or Mitch, do either of you have a contribution you'd like to make on that point, the first steps that organisations should be taking to meet these new requirements that come?
Well, I'm delighted to hear what Richard says, because but actually that's got nothing to do with legislation, really. It's just an informed view of how to get where we want to go. We have to start measuring stuff better. And in terms of energy planning, for example, that has to mean real performance in use. And we're nowhere near that in terms of our regulatory system, as well as the thing which Mitch raised about materials impact, because we don't have a requirement to even disclose, let alone limit, our embodied carbon. So, I just feel in the context of our discussion today, we have to point out that if you want to lead and you want to get there, you have to do the right thing on your own bat, really. And it's being driven, as I think Richard mentioned, by the finance sector. That you can't. It's no good disclosing notional calculations because they're proven to be way off the beam. You have to get down to grips with the real impacts, and that's in a way a very exciting agenda. But I would say regulation isn't helping at the minute.
I would probably add to that as well. I think, and Richard makes a very good point, and we're seeing it more and more, is that the financial sector are quickly changing the way in which people anticipate and respond to wider sustainability issues, not just regulatory ones. And I think regulation is important, it has its place, but actually it's only one of the levers we're seeing being applied at the moment. And I think the finance sector has a long way to go, but actually it's caused a changing of the dial really quickly. I think what we see in regulation and in planning, it's a bit like and it's a bad analogy, I know, an oil tanker turning is very slow in terms of it being able to make maneuvers, but actually the financial requirements we're seeing our clients having to respond to are making those changes happen very quickly. I think that energy, whether we have got a great grip on it or not, people kind of understand what they need to do around that. I completely agree that there are mechanisms that can give you that estimate of what energy use is, but Lynn's absolutely right. There is no mechanism at the moment that regulates or needs or gives us the need or requires us to actually report for actual building performance. I mean, we're seeing neighbours coming, which that's voluntary. It's only within a particular sector, but even then it's stuttered because the BRE won't take it up, or didn't take it up as a mechanism to deliver neighbours in the UK. So I think there's a way to go. I think we are grappling with it, and there's so whilst regulation I think has a role to play, I think broader stakeholder expectation is probably going to force that change more quickly. From a nature point of view, regulation in nature is very site specific. So if you're developing a site in Dagenham, then it's around the site conditions in Dagenham. There isn't a mechanism to understand if your material comes from the Gambon or from a high area of biodiversity value. That currently is something which is coming through as a voluntary approach. It will become regulation, although we have no time frame for that. It will follow on the TCFD kind of trajectory. But at the moment, what's being encouraged is the leaders taking up that mantle of knowing that they have to do something quickly, and that's what's causing that change.
And on that point you raise with regards to the pressures from the finances, is that something that's coming from them having to meet their own regulatory requirements? What's the sort of driving force there?
I think both Richard and Lynn mentioned it. It's from the Paris commitments and the sectorial requirements to adjust actions towards the 1.5 and beyond. So I think it's come from there. There are certain targets. The challenge, I guess, to some extent, is at the moment, sustainable finance or green finance is quite a small sector, albeit it's growing really quickly. What we need to do is we need to direct capital away from its current funding of fossil fuel and industries that currently continue the business as usual, to those businesses and interventions and operations that leave fossil fuel dependency to one side. And whilst that is happening slowly, we collectively need to make that happen quickly. But it does change the dial. We've had clients that have been told that they can't get finance at all on projects unless they have, firstly, their own ESG objectives set in place, but also the action plan of how they're going to align to the 1.5 degree change. So it is changing the discussions really quickly.
Great, thanks. We've got another audience question which says, how effective do you think the Future Homes Standard will be in terms of how the new house building industry will respond? And they also ask, what are the major actions required for the grid to be ready for electrification of heat? Lynn, would you be able to take the first part of that, and then maybe Richard, if you've got any perspective on the second part?
Well, I think I've probably intimated that I think, well, in terms of fabric, they don't really have to do very much because there's no change effectively. But I mean, there's a bit on commissioning of systems, but you're still allowed to have trickle vents with demand extract ventilation, continuous extract. So I would say no great change on fabric, but obviously people are having to come to grips with heat pumps. And I would, that's why I have really concerns about this leaving aside the performance gap in terms of regulation, because as we know, if you're dealing with a home that, as per that study I mentioned, the Homes for 20 building for 2050, if you're getting a massive underperformance on space heating, then the heat pump, it's sized presumably for the worst case scenario, in which case it won't work so well, it won't last so well. It might be noisier because it's working over time. So I'm really concerned that we need to sort of tighten up the whole package, which is what we've been saying really in our response to the Future Homes. So I don't see that much difference. I mean, there are some issues about the way the calculation methodology has been tweaked, and because we've only got a beta version of it, and that's very sort of technical, but from as I understand it, it's very difficult. The house builders are saying they really need the proper bit of kit that they're going to have to use for compliance. That's only fair really, that they should have an up and running version. It just seems to me it's incomplete as a package, which is very much the tone of our response.
Great. And Richard, on that point regarding the electrification of heat.
Well, I mean, we absolutely welcome heat to be electrified. We need to move away from gas. You can't decarbonize without moving away from gas. So that's good. And there has been a slow take up. So anything that drives it forward, and this should do, that we welcome that. But yeah, as Lynn said, it could have gone further. It could have. It still doesn't really address performance gap, and we could have done some more with fabric. Though obviously that increases costs for the homes we're trying to build. But I think it's a small step on the right direction. Is probably where I would say where I'd go with it.
You mentioned that heat networks are not something that we're quite as used to in the UK as perhaps people are in Europe. Is there sort of an education piece here in terms of making the public who aren't necessarily as familiar more aware of the benefits and battle some potential skepticism, and whose responsibility is that, would you say?
Well, I think it's probably everyone's responsibility within the industry, but I think the difference I've found when you go to Europe, or when you speak to people in European cities, they're much more around this is good for us, whereas we're more individualistic. And so actually a lot of it is around the culture of taking away somebody's individual gas boiler that everyone knows, everyone understands, and saying, right, you're going to have this, but you're going to have to link into a system. So there's a cultural piece to it. There's also, I think we need to be quite honest around the efficiencies of heat networks and why they're there. It's quite difficult to get data actually around the performance of heat networks. But they also, we need to make it more desirable. the 5th generation networks can do heating and cooling. And if you're in London or if you're in a big city, it's going to get hot in the future. And actually, the ability to cool your home is going to be just as important as in the summer as keeping it warm in the winter. So I think that we haven't done enough marketing, and I think that probably that's where we need to go. We need to market that this is a really good solution that enables us to decarbonize and is the future and offers benefits. It's a bit like an electric car. They're seen as aspirational things, and that's what we need to make heat networks. Sorry, I'm not sure that really answers your question, but that's my current thinking around heat networks.
Great. We've got a question here about how, obviously, there's a big question around how environmental regulations will impact on housing supply, and there've been a couple of house builders this year who've sort of come out and been a little bit critical of the burden of regulation sort of coming through the pipeline and how it's affecting their ability to proceed with schemes. How do you think organisations can sort of strike a balance between viability and environmental stewardship, particularly when we're already in a fairly difficult housing market already? Mitch, maybe you could give a...
I think the identification of what these implications are will form part of their viability assessment. And whilst, of course, we need to be delivering homes in volume to address the shortage, what we don't want to be doing is delivering homes that need to be retrofitted in 5 years' time because they won't be fit for purpose. They'll overheat, or they're too inefficient in terms of being cost effective to keep warm or cool in the future. So, of course, we need to make sure that they come forward in a way in which they are viable and can be delivered. But it's like anything, I think, it's just identifying what those requirements are and putting them into viability and making sure that there's mechanisms by which they can be delivered. The other thing, of course, is to identify is what we don't want to be doing is excluding areas that should and could have homes being delivered in them because there is a focus on the existing model and short-term returns. What we collectively need to do as an industry is think about longer-term returns, and is that over a different business model, and if what that business model is. I mean, there's lots of interesting projects and joint ventures coming forward where the housing association or the volume house builders and the local authority are sharing the risk and looking at how those homes can be delivered in a way that creates good quality homes that are easy to heat and keep warm, but don't necessarily look at it in a very short time frame. It's a longer term time frame, and I think collectively the industry has to think about that, and we need to enable that to happen. So there's two principal needs here. One is new homes that are cheap and easy to keep warm and keep warm, but we can't do that at the detriment of the environment and the climate, can we? So it's a difficult answer to find, but there are mechanisms out there, and collectively we need to find what those models look like.
Great. We've got a comment here that says, what I take from the panel is that meeting the Future Home Standard is not that onerous for house builders. However, it requires heat pumps, and that the supply chain for heat pumps is underdeveloped and demand low. The question is heat pumps and the sort of immaturity of that market and the lack of progress in building that market up, is that going to be a blocker to us being able to meet those standards required by the future? Lynn, could you take that?
Yeah, I think it is an issue, and I think the last government target was something like 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028, and we just haven't got enough installers, and the rate of installations is woefully low against that target. I think part of the problem is that although there have been these carrots dangled about, they're cheap. Well, they're not exactly cheap, but they're cheaper because there's a government grant, obviously. But you know, there are still people do have concerns. I reflected them in my slides. You know, these concerns about quality, and the evidence that of underperformance means that people, you know, quite genuinely have concerns that just a switch from gas to a heat pump will actually potentially cost them more. And the only way to increase the confidence is to tune up the baseline of regulation, which you know is not happening. So whilst there's still that possibility for some really negative what would you call them, CODIS benefits, you know, whilst, you know, the potential of a backlash, the Daily Mail factor, then I think, you know, consumer confidence isn't going to increase. So heat pump, that take up is really at risk, even though this is the one big sort of positive about this future home standard, that we need to electrify, as both Richard and Mitch have said. You know, it's absolutely inevitable. We must stop using fossil fuels and making our problems worse. But along with the switch, we need these other things to be in place to be able to really get motoring. And, you know, if it is the scale that we're talking about, this is a fantastic market opportunity. And we should be getting, you know, UK heat pump suppliers by the lorry load and investment in manufacturing, but we're not, because of these sort of grey areas. And so it's a wasted opportunity at the minute.
We've got a question here about the circular economy, which says that the laws and regulations for consumer protection are a barrier to progress on this point. The question is, what is the way forward on this? Does anyone have a perspective on
that? We haven't encountered that as yet. So from a circular economy point of view in the building sector and real estate world, I think there is an increasing recognition that firstly, there's a presumption in favour of keeping an existing building rather than necessarily knocking it down and looking to rebuild for the sake of rebuilding. But that does also need to be taken into consideration in the context of how does that building perform in energy terms and environmental terms. So I think it's not a black and white in terms of keeping existing buildings and not bringing forward new buildings. It's a more complicated, nuanced argument than that. But actually, if you're thinking about buildings, what we should be thinking about them as a material bank. So, you know, the amount of bricks they've got, the amount of pieces of timber, you know, how many windows they've got, and if they do need to be changed or they're no longer fit for purpose for whatever reason, how do you repurpose those existing building blocks? So it's a bit like Lego. You know, you design it so that you can put it together, but you can also design it so you take it apart and then reuse it. Some of the challenge is understanding the use of that particular piece of timber or that particular steel beam. So there is a challenge there about the integrity of that material and how it's being used. But there are ways that you can identify that piece. People are using BIM as that repository of information, and you can keep that level of usage with that particular piece of material, and you can track it, and therefore you have that understanding of that warranty will still be in place. So there are ways around it. Of course, it's fair to say that we are in the embryonic stages of understanding what the circular economy means in the real estate world. We have an existing housing and broader real estate stock that is quite old, that wasn't designed with those factors in mind. We are getting our heads around what it means for new buildings and how we can repurpose and reuse materials from old buildings. But and I'm pretty certain that things will get easier, but there are a number of technical as well as regulatory and stakeholder expectations that are causing some of those barriers already.
Thanks, Mitch. It might be good for us to, we've got a couple of minutes left, it might be good for us to sort of turn our attention to the end of the year, or some point in the year when we're expecting a general election. Obviously, there's a decent chance there might be a change of government. How do you think a switch to the Labour Party, for instance, might change some of this regulatory landscape? Are we expecting them to make any big moves in this area? Richard, could you start us off on that?
I think well, certainly for social housing, there's been some positive noises coming out of the Labour Party, so I would hope that they're going to support a little bit more around new buildings and in retrofitting. But the one I'm really interested to see what's going to happen is around GB Energy. And actually, they've got an opportunity here to really start cleaning up our grid, and actually whether or not they start to play a role in heat networks. So I think that's a really exciting thing for me.
Great. Lynn, is there anything you're hearing from the Labour Party?
Well, I was going to say the same thing, really, but for slightly different reasons, because, you know, there's a huge difference between having a target for 2030 to decarbonise our grid and 2035. And if the latter really does become a real target, then we've got to motor, and we've also got to close down, you know, the variables that exist with the performance and the underperformance of our existing stock, as well as the nailing the performance of our new buildings. So I think in order to achieve that target, you have to tighten those things up. But, you know, to accelerate it to 5 years rather than 10 is a big ask, and it would be a great ambition as far as I can see.
I was just going to add and maybe just echo what Lynn has said about the opportunity. I think the thing that people in the real estate are struggling with is that supply chain, is the people that have those skills to both build buildings and homes that we need in the future, but also the retrofit skills as well, particularly in buildings that have heritage or conservation value. And I think that what I would like to see is the government get behind a training program and supply chain program that actually enables that opportunity to come to reality. I think there's a huge transition risk that we have with the existing industries and workmen and the traditional building sector, that we need to move into what those new buildings will need to do and how they'll need to operate. So I think for me, it's both the policy framework being strengthened, but also a leadership around new jobs and green jobs, and enabling the industry to invest in those areas with certainty that it will be supported into the long term.
Great, thanks, Mitch. We're going to have to wrap up in a second, but there's just one question about housing associations that I'd be keen to get Richard's view on. Emma Thurfel asks, what's the view of the panel on hydrogen-powered heating as an alternative to fossil fuels, and how much is it hurting the industry with the government not committing either way yet? It's difficult for housing associations to make investment decisions without that commitment. Is that your perspective, Richard? And what's your view of the prospects of hydrogen?
So hydrogen uses more fossil fuel currently to produce than you get out of the energy. So, but I accept that there will be places where there's huge concentrations of industry where they need a flame, that hydrogen networks will grow there. But for the vast majority of housing associations who are not in those highly industrialized areas where they can use it as a byproduct, I think that hydrogen's a dead duck. From that point of view, it will be used for maybe battery energy storage as potential energy, but electrification is the way to go.
Great. Thanks, Richard. That is about all we have time for. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope you've all found it as informative as I have. You will be able to get the session on demand, as I mentioned earlier, via the same link if you want to watch it again. It should be available about an hour after we finish. If you want to find out more about our upcoming events, you can find details on our website. One more thing is, when we finish, you should see a little survey come up. If you can fill this in, that would be much appreciated. It only takes 30 seconds or so, but it helps us a lot. Thank you again for watching, and have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks all.